All right, for this video, we're going to talk about hybrid mixing. That is mixing with analog gear. So if you're curious about getting into this, or maybe you have a compressor or two and you're looking at how to work it into your mixing workflow, this video is for you because I'm going to be talking more about the how behind this and specifically looking at Logic Pro and how to utilize analog gear in that workflow. I'll probably do a whole nother video about why I use analog gear because I think there's just so much to talk about there. And before you get into analog mixing, one of the major considerations you need to make is, am I willing to bounce everything in real time? And another one is, am I willing to spend time on recall? Because those are kind of the major trade-offs of mixing with analog gear, is the recall and everything having to be printed in real time, which can add a lot of time, especially when you're printing stems and stuff like that. Now that brings up another point. There are kind of two philosophies when it comes to using analog gear while mixing. One philosophy is just, using it everywhere, using it on buses, using it on individual tracks. Maybe you have a lot of gear that you strategically put in different places in your mix, but you're mainly using what's called hardware inserts to route your audio out to your gear and back in so that everything's running in real time. And the next kind of way of using analog gear is committing everything at the track level. And this kind of helps with that trade-off I talked about around bouncing in real time and recall, because you're essentially building your sound once and then committing to it and printing it into your session. So you don't have to worry about recall anymore. And you could then do offline bouncing if everything's already committed at the track level. So both are valid approaches. I actually use a combination of both. I have some processing on my mix bus and my drum bus, but I use a ton of stuff just on the individual track level. And anytime something's on an individual track, I'm going to be committing to it and printing it, because it's just not worth, tying yourself to that extra recall time. And also, if your gear, something goes wrong with it, it needs to be repaired. You're not going to be stuck in that situation if you already have it committed into your session. It also enables you to just use it on a lot more things. If you only have one 1176 and you want to use it on a lot of things, the only way you can do that is by printing it into your session so you can then use it on something else. All right, so that's probably enough talking. Let's actually jump into Logic and I'll talk about hardware inserts and how to set that up. So let's look at the mix bus first. Most people start with mix bus compression because it touches everything in your mix. So it's seemingly, a great way to get analog sound touching all of your audio. So to set up an I/O insert, you just load it like a plugin. You essentially just go down to Utility, I/O, and you bring up the plugin, and you immediately have some options, your output and your input. And so you would set your output to the line outs on your interface that you want to send from, and then your inputs, kind of where those are coming in. I have everything patched through a patch bay, so I can kind of swap things around. If you're curious about setting up patch bays, I'll link the video in the description on that, and you can learn a whole bunch more about that. But yeah, the basic idea here is you're creating an audio loop out of your interface and then back into it, and you're compensating for latency. And so down here, you basically click ping, and that calculates your latency for you so that everything is synced up properly. Another handy thing is you can make some subtle adjustments to the output and input here. So if I just want to drive the compressor a little harder, I can, bump this up 1 dB. And this is something that I actually do because when it comes to bus compressors, I like to make recall as easy as possible. And so generally I'm staying within a certain range of settings. I like to keep my threshold in a very tight range. And essentially, if I need to drive it harder, I'll turn up the output gain a little bit, or I'll turn it down if it's hitting it too hard. I will adjust the hardware threshold, to taste in some of the settings, but I like to keep that in a tight range just so it's really easy and I'm not too far off as soon as I bring up the I/O plugin and start mixing. So on my mix bus, I'm using the Audioscape SSL style bus compressor, but then that's also feeding into a pair of Heritage Audio preamps for a little bit of saturation kind of on the output stage of that. And so with that, I actually have to worry about calibrating the left and right channel, because the preamps, when I'm driving them, I have the output trim, which isn't detented, so I can't click it to an exact setting. So I have to make sure the left and right channels are actually sitting at the right level. And the easiest way I've found to do that is with an EQ curve analyzer. There's a free one called the Birdum EQ analyzer. So I'll set that right before the plugin, the IO plugin, and then after, and I can see my channels are lined up. And if I go and reach over here, you can see how, they weren't lined up, and then I can kind of exactly match them. I can even like zoom in if I want to get like really precise with it. But that's just a good way to make sure left and right channel are working. And it's nice if you have hardware EQ and you need to match the EQ curves on the left and right channel. This can be an awesome way to do that as well. So, all right, let's actually listen to some audio now. I'm just gonna play a section of the chorus without the hardware, and then I'm gonna bring it in. Watch it drift away. All right, so that's the basics of using a hardware insert on a bus. So I use one on my mix bus. I also use one on my drum bus with the decomp compressor, or actually often my drum plus bass bus, so I can kind of glue those pieces together in the mix. But those are the two kind of main ways I use bus processing. So now we're gonna talk about using it on individual tracks. So it's basically the same process. So let's look at vocals, because that's another really common thing that I do. You can see here, I have my original vocal track, and then down here I have the hardware print of it. So when I'm going to do a vocal process, I'm going to first do a little bit of EQ usually. And I could do this in the hardware realm, but I like using ProQ for this just because you have a little bit more control over the EQ curves. And so I'll do a little bit of attenuation in the low end before I go to compression. And then I'll bring up my IO plugin just like I did for the mix bus. But in this case, I'm going to my 1176. And sometimes I'll do a more, complex chain of, going to my BAE preamp for a little bit of saturation, and then going to the 1176, and then my LA2A clone. And so I'll have like a really nice chain of hardware compression going. So basically, I'm committing that and the vocal sounds virtually finished, which is really nice. After I set up the insert and dial it in, get it sounding how I want, the next step is to actually create a print track. So I'm just gonna duplicate this and bypass these plugins for now. And so you can see here I created a send. So in order to route this so that the latency compensation that I calculated stays, and is printed into the audio so everything stays in sync, I need to route this to a bus. So I routed to bus 45 and I sent that pre-fader. I set the output of that bus to no output because this isn't to do any parallel effects. This is just to do some routing. I made sure the bus was mono by selecting the channel mode here. And then down on the print track, I selected that bus as the input. And so essentially it's going to be routing through these plugins, including the hardware, and then to this bus, which is then feeding this track here. And then from there, all I do is hit record and it's going to print my audio onto that track. So let's do that right here. I drive into the familiar dark with the windows down, the smell of pines fills the car. And then essentially from there, I can just kind of bypass the track, hide it, jump to the next track and print that as well. However many times I want, I can use this compressor across every track in the mix if I'm patient enough. But yeah, that's how I commit the track. And this is something I'll do for vocals a lot. It's something I do for bass. I love doing parallel compression on drums. So you can see here, I have some pretty crushed drums. In fact, I love with hardware compression specifically, when you push it really hard, that's where it really shines. That's where it has the most, I think, unique character, and you can hear bigger differences between hardware and plugin equivalents. Is, all buttons in 1176, just kind of smashing it. It has a very different character, and that doesn't mean that the plugin is bad, but one thing I've noticed with my compressor, for example, is that it can retain transients even when it's pushed really hard, the hardware specifically. So if I want to maintain a little bit more, transient punch with that compression, then I'll opt for the hardware. But if I want it to be a little bit more kind of splatty and squashed feeling, the plugin sometimes can have kind of a softer, squishier feel that works well for that. So those are the basic ways that I use analog gear. I'll also sometimes mix through guitar pedals or my tape machine. Right now, my tape machine is getting serviced, so I don't have it here, but I'll do the same process essentially, where I'll set up the I/O plugin, I'll print through a bus, and commit processing and kind of shape sounds. And I usually do that before I'm adding the hardware bus compression, because sometimes I like using my bus compressors to process individual tracks as well. So again, it takes some patience and time, and you have to really be okay with committing to a sound, but analog gear can be really fun to mix with, and it can yield some really unique, cool sounds. And that's something I love about it, is there's kind of an unpredictability to it, and I think it's really fun. So hopefully this helps. If I didn't cover something you have questions about, let me know down in the comments, and I'm going to do another video sometime about why I use analog gear and what I think the benefits are when there's so many amazing plugins. So anyway, I'll see you in the next video.